Blood drops stained the pristine snow, creating a haunting trail that wildlife ranger Mark Sullivan would never forget. Each crimson mark led him deeper into the Montana wilderness on that bitter January morning. The temperature had plunged to 20 below zero, and the wind howled through the trees like a mournful cry. But it was another sound that made Mark's heart stop, a single whimper, barely audible above the winter storm. What he discovered in that snow-covered clearing would change his life forever. There, curled into a tight ball of matted fur and fading hope, lay a bear cub no older than 3 months. Its small body trembled violently against the merciless cold, and its eyes, glazed with pain, held a look that transcended the barrier between human and animal, a plea for help that struck straight to Mark's soul. The signs of trauma were everywhere. Gashes marked the cub's side where predators had tried to claim an easy meal, and its emaciated frame told a story of weeks without proper food. Mark had seen death in these mountains countless times before, each one a reminder of nature's harsh law of survival. But something about this tiny fighter sparked a fierce protectiveness he had never felt in his 15 years as a ranger. Time slipped away like the snowflakes melting on his gloves. The cub's breaths grew shallower with each passing second, creating small clouds in the frigid air. Mark knew that touching a wild animal, especially a bear, went against every protocol in the Ranger Handbook. Yet, as he watched the life slowly ebbing from this innocent creature, protocol seemed meaningless against the weight of his conscience. With trembling hands that had nothing to do with the cold, Mark made a decision that would set in motion an extraordinary journey of survival, bonds forged in desperation, and a reunion that would eventually bring tears to the eyes of millions. As he wrapped his thermal emergency blanket around the cub's freezing body, he whispered a promise that would echo through the years: "Fight, little one. Just fight." Little did Mark know, this moment of compassion in the unforgiving wild would create a connection so powerful it would challenge everything we thought we knew about the relationship between humans and wild animals. The Mountain View Wildlife Center erupted into urgent activity when Mark burst through its doors, cradling the dying cub. The bundle in his arms barely moved now, and the weak pulse beneath his fingers served as a terrifying countdown. A team of veterinarians, led by Dr. Sarah Chan, immediately transformed their medical bay into an intensive care unit for their smallest patient. The next 72 hours tested the limits of both human dedication and animal resilience. The cub, whom the staff named Spirit for his unwillingness to give up, teetered between life and death. His body temperature had dropped to dangerous levels, and an infection raged through his small frame. Every hour brought a new crisis: failing kidneys, irregular heartbeat, pneumonia. The medical team worked in shifts, but Mark refused to leave. His ranger duties were temporarily reassigned, and hour after hour, he sat next to the incubator, talking softly about the forest where he had found Spirit, about the mountains, about life. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, when even the machines seemed to hum more softly, Mark would gently stroke Spirit's fur through the medical gloves, willing his own strength into the tiny body fighting so hard to survive. On the 4th day, when exhaustion had carved deep lines into every face at the center, Spirit opened his eyes. It was a moment that stopped time. His gaze, clearer now but still filled with pain, fixed directly on Mark. In that instant, something profound passed between them, something that went beyond the normal boundaries of human and wild animal. Spirit lifted his head slightly, and for the first time since his rescue, tried to move toward the human who had saved him. Dr. Chen called it a miracle. Spirit's blood work started showing improvement, and his fever finally broke. But the greatest transformation was in his spirit. Despite his trauma and natural instincts, the young bear began responding to Mark's presence in unprecedented ways. When Mark spoke, Spirit's ears would perk up. When Mark entered the room, the cub's eyes would follow him. It was as if he remembered not just the rescue but every hour Mark had spent willing him to live. The staff watched in amazement as this connection deepened. They had seen many animals recover at the center, but never had they witnessed such a profound bond form between a wild creature and a human. While they celebrated Spirit's improving health, they also worried. Getting too attached to humans could be dangerous for a bear who would eventually need to return to the wild. Yet, Mark understood something that others didn't. This bond might be exactly what Spirit needed to find the strength to survive. As spring painted the Montana mountains with new life, Spirit grew stronger each day. The tiny cub who had once fit in Mark's arms now weighed over 60 pounds, his dark fur thick and glossy, his eyes bright with curiosity and intelligence. The rehabilitation center had become his temporary home, complete with a specially designed enclosure that mimicked his natural habitat. The challenge facing the wildlife team grew more complex with each passing week. While Spirit needed to learn essential bear behaviors, his attachment to Mark remained uncommonly strong. Other rescued bears typically showed fear or aggression toward humans, but Spirit was different. He would watch through the enclosure fence as Mark prepared his food, making soft huffing sounds that the staff began to recognize as greeting calls. Mark worked closely with Dr. Chen to develop a rehabilitation plan that would honor their unique bond while preparing Spirit for eventual release. They used innovative techniques, hiding Spirit's food throughout the enclosure to encourage his natural foraging instincts. Mark would demonstrate from outside the fence how to tear apart logs to find insects, and remarkably, Spirit would imitate him. The bear's intelligence amazed everyone at the center. As months passed, Spirit learned to fish in his enclosure's pond, his powerful paws swiping at the water with increasing skill. He showed natural talents for climbing and digging, activities critical for survival in the wild. But it was the quiet moments that touched the hearts of everyone at the center. Sometimes, in the early morning hours, Mark would arrive to find Spirit sitting near the fence, waiting for him, as if they shared a secret language that transcended their different species. The story of Mark and Spirit began spreading beyond the center's walls. Local news stations ran features about the remarkable bond between the ranger and the bear he had saved. Wildlife researchers visited to document their unprecedented relationship, amazed by how Spirit maintained both his wild instincts and his gentle connection with Mark. Their story touched something deep in people's hearts, a reminder that compassion could bridge even the widest of natural gaps. Yet, with each passing month, Mark carried a bittersweet weight in his heart. Spirit was now approaching his second year, growing into a magnificent young bear who needed more space than the center could provide. The day of release loomed closer, bringing with it a storm of emotions that Mark struggled to contain. He knew that for Spirit to truly live, they would have to say goodbye. But neither of them could have predicted the extraordinary circumstances that would bring them together again in a moment that would move millions to tears. The autumn morning of Spirit's release dawned crisp and clear in the Montana wilderness. Golden sunlight filtered through the changing leaves, but the beauty of the day stood in stark contrast to the heaviness in Mark's heart. At 3 years old, Spirit had grown into a magnificent bear, weighing over 400 pounds. His thick brown fur rippled with muscle beneath, and his eyes held the wild wisdom he would need to survive. The release site had been carefully chosen, A remote area deep in the national forest with abundant food sources and far from human settlements. The transport cage sat ready on the back of the center's truck, but getting Spirit into it proved more challenging than anyone had anticipated. Despite years of training, he seemed to sense that something was different today. He paced his enclosure, making distressed sounds that tore at Mark's heart. Only when Mark stood near the cage did Spirit finally enter. The team worked quickly to secure the door, but no one missed the way Spirit's eyes remained locked on Mark throughout the process. The journey to the release site was charged with emotion. Mark rode in the back with Spirit, speaking softly to him one last time, sharing memories of their journey together, from that desperate day in the snow to this moment of bittersweet triumph. The 2-hour drive through winding mountain roads felt both too long and too short. Each mile brought them closer to their final goodbye, and Mark found himself speaking more urgently, trying to compress 3 years of love and care into these last precious moments. He told Spirit about the forest that would become his home, about the streams full of fish, and about the berry patches that would sustain him through late summer. Whether the bear understood the words didn't matter, it was the gentle rumble of Mark's voice that seemed to keep Spirit calm. At the release site, surrounded by towering pines and distant mountain peaks, the team prepared for the final step. Mark positioned himself to open the cage door. The moment stretched like honey, thick with unspoken emotions. When the door finally swung open, Spirit did not bolt as most bears would. Instead, he emerged slowly, his nose testing the air of freedom. Then, Spirit did something that left everyone present in tears. Instead of running for the trees, he turned and walked toward Mark. The wildlife team held their breath, protocols forgotten in this extraordinary moment. Spirit stopped a few feet from his savior and rose slightly on his hind legs, his familiar huffing sound carrying on the mountain air. In his eyes, Mark saw recognition, trust, and something that looked remarkably like gratitude. Mark had been coached for weeks about the importance of sending Spirit away with authority to break their bond for the bear's own safety, but in that moment, his voice failed him. Tears streamed down his face as he whispered, "Go on, buddy. Be free." Spirit held his gaze for one more moment, as if memorizing Mark's face, before finally turning toward the forest. His powerful form disappeared into the undergrowth, leaving only swaying branches and profound silence. The team stood motionless, witnessing not just the release of a rehabilitated animal but the end of something extraordinary. Even Dr. Chen, who had overseen countless releases, wiped tears from her eyes. The mountains seemed to hold their breath, marking this moment when a remarkable chapter in both their lives came to a close. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Mark finally turned away from the forest's edge. The drive back to the center was quiet, each person lost in their own thoughts about what they had witnessed. Mark's hand rested on the empty cage, still warm from Spirit's presence, knowing that while this goodbye was necessary, it carved a space in his heart that would never quite be filled the same way again. 3 years had passed since Spirit's release, each season carrying Mark further from that emotional farewell in the mountain clearing. The tracking collar had long since gone silent, leaving only memories and hope that Spirit was thriving in his wild home. Mark had settled into his ranger routine, though his daily patrols always felt quieter without his beloved bear friend to visit. On a crisp autumn morning, much like the day of Spirit's release, everything changed. The call came in from a remote research station deep in the national forest. Their cameras had captured images of a massive brown bear living in an unusual territory pattern, circling the same areas where humans occasionally passed through. The behavior was concerning enough that they needed an experienced ranger to investigate. Mark didn't dare hope as he drove toward the research station, but something about this call felt different. The researchers described a bear that showed no aggression, just unusual interest in human activities. They mentioned its distinctive way of watching people, with an intelligence that made several researchers comment on its unique behavior. The researchers had compiled weeks of footage, and Mark's hands trembled slightly as he reviewed it. The bear was massive, easily over 600 pounds now, but it was the eyes that made his heart stop. Even through the grainy footage, there was something hauntingly familiar about the way this bear moved, the way it held its head, the careful way it observed the world around it. "We need you to help us assess if this bear poses any risk," the lead researcher explained, showing Mark a map of the bear's territory. Mark's breath caught in his throat. The territory centered almost perfectly around the old release site, the place where he had said goodbye to Spirit 3 years ago. The bear had maintained its territory there season after season in an area where bears typically roamed much more widely. As Mark prepared for the field investigation scheduled for the next morning, he could barely contain the mix of emotions surging through him. Professional training told him not to assume anything. This could be any bear, and even if it was Spirit, years in the wild could have erased any memory of their bond. Yet, his heart raced with possibility. He spent that night reviewing old photos of Spirit, studying the distinctive markers that might help him identify his old friend. Sleep proved impossible as memories flooded back, the tiny cub in the snow, the long nights of rehabilitation, the gentle huffing sounds that had been their private language. Tomorrow would either bring the most extraordinary reunion or confirm that it was time to finally let go of hope. Little did Mark know, as he prepared for the next day's expedition, that he was about to experience a moment so powerful it would touch the hearts of millions and remind the world that some bonds transcend all boundaries of time, space, and even species themselves. Dawn broke over the mountain research station with a golden urgency that seemed to match Mark's racing heart. A small team had gathered for the expedition, 2 wildlife researchers, a documentary photographer who had been studying the unusual bear, and Dr. Chen, who had driven up specially after hearing about the possibility that it might be Spirit. The morning air was crisp with early frost as they hiked toward the bear's known territory. The photographer, Amy Wilson, quietly explained how she had been tracking this particular bear for weeks, amazed by its unusual behavior. Mark listened intently to every detail, his trained ear catching the similarities to the Spirit he had known. "The bear often sits near the hiking trails in the early morning," Amy explained, showing Mark recent photographs on her camera. "It's like he's watching, waiting for something. But never aggressive, never even approaching humans, just observing." They reached a clearing that overlooked a small valley where the bear had been spotted regularly. The team set up their observation equipment with practiced efficiency, but the silence among them was charged with anticipation. Mark's hands shook slightly as he raised his binoculars, scanning the tree line. The wait stretched for hours. The sun climbed higher, warming the frost into dew. Dr. Chen had just suggested they try another location when movement at the forest edge caught their attention. A massive brown bear emerged from the shadows, its fur gleaming in the morning light. Mark's breath caught in his throat. Even at this distance, there was something achingly familiar about the way the bear moved. Then it lifted its head, testing the air, and Mark felt tears spring to his eyes. He would know those eyes anywhere. Without thinking, Mark took a step forward. Dr. Chen reached for his arm, but he gently shook his head. The bear had already noticed them. Instead of retreating, it stood its ground, head raised, nose working the air currents. Then came a sound that brought Mark to his knees, a soft, distinctive huff that had haunted his dreams for 3 years. "It's him," Mark whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "It's Spirit." The bear took a step forward, then another. The research team held their breath, cameras whirring softly as they documented this extraordinary moment. Spirit moved with the confidence of a wild animal, but with an intentionality that seemed almost human. When he was about 30 feet away, he stopped and rose slightly on his hind legs, exactly as he had done the day of his release. Mark couldn't hold back any longer. "Hey, buddy," he called softly, his voice breaking. "Do you remember me?" What happened next left everyone present in tears. Spirit made his distinctive huffing sound again and moved forward with purpose. The research team started to back away, but Mark stood his ground, tears flowing freely now. Spirit approached until he was just a few feet away, close enough for Mark to see the intelligence still burning in those familiar eyes. Then Spirit did something that defied everything the researchers knew about wild bears. He lowered his massive head and gently bumped against Mark's outstretched hand, exactly as he used to do as a cub. The touch lasted only a moment, but it sent Amy and Dr. Chen to their knees, sobbing at this impossible display of recognition and trust. "That's my boy," Mark whispered, his own tears falling unchecked. "That's my brave boy." For several minutes, Spirit remained close, making soft huffing sounds that the team's recordings would later confirm matched exactly the vocalizations from his rehabilitation days. The bear's behavior showed clear recognition while maintaining his wild nature, a perfect balance that left the research team in awe. When Spirit finally turned to leave, it wasn't with fear or haste. He moved with the dignity of a wild animal who had chosen to share a sacred moment. At the forest edge, he turned back one last time, meeting Mark's eyes with that same soulful gaze that had captured his heart in the snow years ago. The story of their reunion spread rapidly, touching hearts around the world. The video Amy captured went viral, moving millions to tears as they witnessed this extraordinary moment of recognition between a wild bear and the man who had saved him. Wildlife experts studied the footage in amazement, forced to reconsider everything they thought they knew about animal memory and emotional bonds. The research station established a protected zone in Spirit's territory, ensuring he could live his wild life undisturbed while allowing Mark to visit occasionally as part of his ranger duties. Their reunions, though rare, remained profound, each one a reminder that love, once given freely, never truly fades. Spirit and Mark's extraordinary bond reminds us that every animal deserves a chance at life, and each of us has the power to make a difference. While not everyone will rescue a bear cub from the snow, we can all contribute to wildlife protection in our own way. Whether it's supporting your local wildlife rehabilitation center through donations or volunteer work, learning about and reporting wildlife in need, or simply sharing stories of hope like Spirits to raise awareness, your actions matter. The number for wildlife emergencies in your area is just a search away, and saving it could help you become someone's Mark Sullivan one day. Every animal deserves their own Spirit story. Will you help write the next one?